Hi, welcome to Module 2, which is drawn from material in Chapter 1 of your textbook, Setting the Scene. Apologies if there's any confusion. Module 1, which we reviewed last class, and which is available on Moodle as a recorded audio presentation as well. In that we reviewed critical management studies, which comes from largely from the introduction to your textbook. So before chapter 1, the introduction, and so not to confuse you too much, but that was module 1. Now we're on to module 2, and we're looking at what kind of factors might be important in looking at the study of management and organizations today, contemporary topics. Not all of them, but many of them that should be of concern to people trying to understand behavior in an organizational context. So, what you discover if you study management and organizations critically is that organizations do not exist in a vacuum. There is a context, what your textbook refers to as scene setting issues. And where do these scene setting issues come from? How can I know more about scene setting issues? And so this is because the study of management and organizations is it's a complex study. We draw on a whole number of different disciplines and other areas of interest from a social relations point of view and a technology point of view, actually. And so some of these issues, trends, and so on that we will blend into our study to help us understand why management organization is the way it is, include history. You've heard the term or the phrase, I think, history as, or the past is prologue. That means that what happened in the past isn't irrelevant and didn't just end, it created the setting for what's happening now. And we can easily reach back 70, 80, 100 years to find developments in, especially in the West, in modern management and organization, to tell us why things are the way they are today. A lot of students and a lot of professors seem to assume that it's almost as if the study of business erupted out of nothing. But of course, there was a stage already set for this study, and if we study the past, we can have a much better sense of what's going on today. In addition, economics will play an important role, especially in this case in organizational behavior, labor economics, wages and minimum wages and things like that. In addition, politics themselves are a very interesting study. Even though we're not studying political science as such, many of the tools you're going to learn in this course, or that are available for you to learn, at least, it's up to you whether you learn them or not, could be applied to political organizations as well as business and other organizations. Governments, of course, set policy. So what is the effect of policy on behavior? This is a particular area of interest to me, not just from government set policy, but also from what courts tell us is appropriate in the workplace. So my particular area of expertise and interest is what happens when people are unfairly disciplined or fired. It's called, the area of law is called wrongful dismissal, and it takes up a big part of the case law in Canada. It has a lot to say about how management manages. Then we have, of course, the evolving mores and values of society, and what that tells us about what is appropriate in terms of business behavior. And technology, of course, guides much of our behavior in the workplace. In fact, there is a theory of behavior that is called socio-technology, and the object of the study is to blend or to determine, I guess, what the impact of adding or changing technology in the workplace, what effect that has on the sociology of work. How does it affect how workers behave in the workplace? Then I already mentioned values, societal values change, culture changes over time. As an example, for instance, one of my former students did a study of the introduction, honor student, did a study of the introduction of decriminalizing cannabis. How many years ago was that now? 5, 6 years ago? And that turned up some pretty interesting findings that HR in many organizations was absolutely not ready for those changes in the workplace. And it'd be interesting to see 5 to 10 years later what, if any, impact that might have had on the typical workplace, and so on. And so there are other things we could consider as well. This is kind of an interesting movie. It's from the I'm going to say the 1930s, 20s or 30s. I'd have to check to see how long ago it was, but it's uh, this is just before the talkies, when movies started to talk to us, and the actor's name and the creator, the director, and so on of the film. I think he was director as well. Was a very famous character called his real name was Charlie Chaplin. Uh, he created some really movies that still persist to this day, and in terms of their interest to a modern audience. And what's interesting about this particular movie is that it depicts it depicts the end of privacy in the workplace. It depicts surveillance. It depicts the organization, the workplace as a machine, and the employee as simply another cog in the machine, simply another replaceable part in the machine, and what that does to the dehumanization of the worker in the workplace. And so this movie is about 100 years old, and yet it still speaks to us of the kind of experience that workers have in the workplace. So the metaphor we're referring to here is the organization as machine. If you need, to find an example of this in the modern workplace, you need go no further than a McDonald's restaurant, and look how the production and sale and so on of the even down to the menu choices. Look how standardized and automated the systems are, and even how automated the behavior of the workers is in a McDonald's restaurant. It is essentially the epitome of a machine. Another very common metaphor that's often used, and when these metaphors are used to describe business, the people who are using the metaphors often don't even appreciate that they are using a metaphor to describe the business. Let me give you an example. Before I get to the next metaphor, the organization as machine. Have you ever heard somebody refer to some organization as a well-oiled machine? That's exactly what they're referring to. The parts all work together smoothly and all that sort of stuff. So it's all throughout literature and business writing. Everywhere you look, you will find that metaphor. Another metaphor that you will find everywhere in business writing, and again, the people who are writing this stuff don't necessarily even know that they're using a metaphor, and that is the machine as organism. So they'll talk about survival of the fittest, competition, and what are some of the other phrases they would use to describe this? It's a vicious dog eat dog world. All of these refer to the idea, at least the concept, that in nature competition rules, that only the rugged and self-reliant survive. Now, what that misses, and it's a it's not a totally inappropriate comparison or analogy to draw, but what they miss in doing that kind of analogy or leaning on that metaphor is they miss that nature isn't just about competition. Look into a forest and see how many species coexist in a forest. A forest wouldn't be a forest without all kinds of different kinds of plants and animals. In other words, in the forest, and you will find, by the way, that in the forest, there is an awful lot of cooperation in the forest. So, yes, there's competition, but there's also a hell of a lot of cooperation. How can those two things exist at the same time? A lot of business writers don't seem to be able to figure that out. And especially an American centric view of business and marketing in particular, there is a very little sense that they're relying on this particularly lopsided metaphor that doesn't even reflect nature. They think it's natural for a competition to be the deciding factor, when in fact it's also natural for cooperation to be the deciding factor. So we we again we rely, or we don't rely. Actually, we fail to give enough credit to things that are happening around us. And so some of the things that we won't be talking about in this chapter, but which do inform our understanding of management and organization studies and practice today, are issues or ideas like sometimes referred to as large-scale social formations. So when we look at the development of management and organization thought today and practice, one of the and I was stumped by this when I started my PhD program about more than 20 years ago now. I was looking at my first year assignment list of topics that I could write about for my first paper, and one of the topics on the list for it was basically, I think we were studying the philosophy of management. That was our first course, or one of our first courses in management studies, that first year of the PhD program. And one of the topics was Cold War, and I said, what the hell does the Cold War have to do with management and organization studies? And for those of you who probably, and some of you, I'm sure, are not familiar with the Cold War, it is something that evolved right after the Second World War, a tension between the former Soviet Union, the USSR, and the West, led by the US, the United States. We were part, of course, and we still are, part of the Western alliances, and we faced off across the the so-called Iron Curtain, which was, in some places, some parts of Europe, was a literal wall. And in Germany, for instance, there were walls, and other places as well throughout Europe, there were walls thrown up by the USSR between their block of, it was called the Warsaw Pact, the block of countries that aligned themselves forcibly, in most cases, forcibly aligned themselves with the Soviet Union. Many of those countries today are free of Russian control. Think of the Baltic states, the Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Latvia is the country where Canadian army troops, are stationed right now as a bulwark against the possible invasion by Russia. And so we're there to sort of bolster the local army and create a presence, a NATO presence, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to tell Russia that we won't let them invade our allies. Anyway, so from the say 1947 probably but it really began right after the end of the Second World War, or even before the end of the Second World War, until about 1989-90, when the Soviet Union fell apart and became Russia. There was this cold tension between the two, and the world was essentially divided down the middle. The Soviet Union and its allies and anybody it could bring into its orbit on one side, and the West, us and the US and other Western countries on the other side facing off. And it was called cold because essentially there never was a hot war between those two enemies. There were some surrogate wars, like in Vietnam, Korea, and elsewhere, where surrogate troops, the troops of North Korea and South Korea fought, but the troops of Russia and Canada or the U.S. Never had to fight against each other. We refer to it as the Cold War. Now you might be saying, like I did, 20 odd years ago, what the hell does the Cold War have to do with management and organization? Well, because we in the West wanted to justify, especially in the US, we wanted to justify huge expenditures on weapon systems. How are you going to do that if you can't demonstrate to the public that there's a difference between you and the enemy? Otherwise, people will be saying, let's sue for peace. Let's go to the negotiating table. And so you really the West had to say, no, look, the Soviet Union, they can't be trusted. And so they would, the Soviet Union would be described as the Red Horde, the Communist Red Horde, commies. And just think about American culture today, still labeling people communists, even though they're nothing like communists. It's a way of differentiating from people you don't like. People you want to label as an enemy. So it still persists today. And then on the Western side, on our side, workers and others were labeled as spiritual. In other words, we believed in a God, and we went to church every Sunday, and we prayed, and we believed in individualism, and where the Soviet was about a collective society. We were about, and central planning, by the way, and we were about individual initiative and entrepreneurship and all that kind of crap, and spirituality, believe it or not, because of course the Soviets were the central ideology of the Soviet Union, the communist ideology, was essentially against religion, which is kind of funny today because now the Russia government, the Russian state, is allied with the Russian Orthodox Church, which is essentially Catholicism in Russia. Isn't that interesting? How, anyway, former cold bedmates become hot bedmates. Anyway, so it influenced the way textbooks were written. We find real evidence. In fact, I've got a paper called "The Quiet Americans," which lays out my arguments for why this ideological battle between these two powerful enemies is represented in teaching materials and research materials related to management and organization studies. Some of the other things that might be more relevant today than the Cold War: the rise of feminism, the war on terror, and the war on drugs, which are also maybe not as current today as they were, but now today we might talk about the war on women, the war on immigrants, the war on wokeism, and maybe there are some other, social formations that I'm missing. I'm sure there are. If you can think of any, let me know. What is it you see when you look out into the context of management and organization? So these are some of the topics I want to talk about today. I probably won't talk about all of them, but there are some important things I want to discuss here. Globalization, for one thing, and one of the reasons for dealing with globalization is that in a typical business program, it's really defined and employed as a term in a very lopsided way, a very managerial way. And yet, our understanding of globalization and its effect on the human condition is way more complex and nuanced than that, and so it deserves an introduction. Next is, and this is very, very topical, the idea of corporate social responsibility, sometimes referred to as CSR. So if you hear that phrase, that's what they're talking about. On its face, it sounds very needed, very necessary. But when you look into its actual application, you begin to understand that there are serious problems with it. And an allied idea is ESG, which stands for Environment and Social Governance. And it's very similar to corporate social responsibility, but it's a response to, and actually you'll see elements of this or parallels in this with what I've told you about my interests here as well. I have an interest in social and environmental conditions for humanity, and here it is right here in this thing called ESG, the environment, social governance. And so they purport in this movement, the ESG movement, they purport to be concerned about the governance of businesses in terms of their environmental and social outcomes. What we find, though, is that the application of this theory, let's call it, or this concept, this framework, results in some really crazy outcomes, some really crazy evaluations of some businesses that doesn't make any sense. And I'll try to explain more of that to you on a separate slide. We're also going to talk a little bit about trends in the workplace, a little bit about men and women in the workplace, a little bit about working hours in the workplace, a little bit about home working as well, which is obviously making the home a workplace, a very little bit, maybe not at all, on human trafficking, but well, let me say something about human trafficking now. It's likely that even though slavery was ascribed a period of history which was essentially thought to be, ending maybe 150 years ago, there are probably as many people in slave conditions working today as there was in the mid 1800s. In other words, even though the proportion of people held in slavery today is proportionately lower than it was, much lower than it was in the 1800s, it's the same, roughly the same number of people are still working in slave-like conditions. And we find people working on fishing boats, for instance, in far-flung places like the Antarctic and Indian Oceans and South Atlantic and places like that, and they're essentially working in slave conditions. They cannot get off their ships, and they're basically held there for months and even years at a time. In Africa, there are very, very poor countries like Eritrea. I'm actually currently just beginning a study of a Canadian company and its complicity in a mining operation in Eritrea, which is Eastern Africa, a very, very, very poor, very dysfunctional company. And a Canadian company is there, or was there at least. They sold their operation because it got too hot for them politically, but they were knowingly using slave labor to develop that mine. They didn't hire the slaves or capture the slaves and employ them. It was actually a local organization, but they knowingly used the fruits of their labor. It was a well-known artifact of their business. And so in my study, I'm going to try to get to the bottom of that. Although it's already been fairly well documented, nobody, as far as I know, has ever turned it into a management and organization case study, a research program, or a teaching case either. And there are lots of other examples. Even here in Canada, I've heard estimates that as many as 10,000 people are here in Canada in slavery. What? Yeah. So those would be the highlights. Now let's look at some trends in the Canadian workforce And right off the bat, I'll apologize that some of these figures are old. When I'm citing sources from 2015, they're almost a decade old, and actually some of them may be more than a decade old. But what's important isn't the exact number so much as the trends that these numbers represent. And so let's begin by looking at the balance between men and women in the workplace. We're looking at a balance we're pretty close to an equal balance between men and women in the workplace today. Women still represent a smaller proportion of the workforce than men do, but not by a lot, a few percent. But one thing I want to point out about the representation of women in the workplace is that even if we go back 60, 70, 80 years, women even then represented about 30% of workers. So the proportion hasn't changed that much in 60, 70, 80 years. What may have changed, well, the number has gone up, but what may have changed is, what has changed is that women were largely only in support roles, those many decades ago. As an example, women following the Second World War, for instance, or even back before the war in the 30s, when airlines, flying became a publicly available service, the airlines hired nurses because guess what? Nurses, they're used to dealing with emergencies and with ill people and blah 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 blah, and oh, they can look good and they can do themselves up and they can be appealing and aesthetically appropriate for our largely male audience, and so they were their place in the workplace was driven by aesthetics and that they were almost always in support or service roles. Think about teachers. Public school teachers were largely limited to primary to six. And in junior high and senior high, suddenly men took up the majority of the roles, and women were only there in support roles, such as librarians, for instance. And that changed and is still changing over time. But there were a large number of women in the workplace, nurses, for instance, secretaries, typists, filing clerks, waitresses, on and on. All of these women in support roles. Interestingly, as well, it looks like unemployment rates have gone up for men over time and are relatively a little bit lower for women. And I think that's still true, a decade after those figures were published. And I would argue it this way: what's happening is that in today's sort of current climate, current workplace, women have more appropriate skills. They also, and this is a sort of dirty little secret of hiring women. We'll talk about this maybe later in this presentation, actually, that women make less money than men. It's a sort of dirty little secret of the workplace. In particular, it's a dirty little secret of small universities like Acadia. Now, Acadia has done a lot. The women of Acadia here have done a lot to reverse pay inequities. I was actually quite impressed when I got here, a decade and a half ago, to see just how active they were in researching and publicizing differences in pay. But at other small universities where I've taught, it was sort of like a strategy, a tactic of the university administration to keep their costs down. We can hire women for, maybe 10% less than we hire a man. So why wouldn't we hire a woman? And that still happens today. Quite often, women's experience is negated compared to the men, and sometimes it seems to have some merit. But think about why men might have more appropriate experience than women. Because the men have been able to go out, leave the home, leave the children in their mother's care at home, and go out and get the experience while women stay at home and look after the children and don't get a chance to get that experience. So we have to be very, very cautious that we are not inappropriately rewarding men simply for being the dominant sex. It's a tough a problem to work with, but women are. And the other thing about this, I guess I should add to this too, is that oftentimes women don't fight for better pay. So if you put a woman and a man in separately in a hiring before a hiring committee or before the dean who's doing the final sort of acknowledgement that somebody's being offered a job, um, first off, the man will probably be offered more money than tend to be offered more money than the woman. And the woman will maybe not insist on better pay, but the man might. So there's a difference in the sort of culture of men and women in terms of their their attitude toward pay and their value in the workplace. So so a couple things here. Women have to learn to value themselves and fight for what they're actually worth, and it is worth fighting. Let me tell you, my first full-time job as an academic, I knew specifically that my employer was offering me about I think it would have been about $3,000 or $4,000 less than a friend was being offered at the same institution. And I said, I want what my friend is getting. And they kind of looked at me strangely, but then they said, okay. It wasn't a big deal. In the end, it wasn't a big deal. And I ended up making slightly more money than I would have otherwise. But women tend not to ask for things like that. And one more thing about older workers, so I'll talk about older workers first of all. We have over the last couple of decades, we've seen that employment rates for older workers has increased. In other words, people tend to stay in the workplace longer than, or to at least to an older age than they might have in the past. Whereas in the past, when you turned 65, you were actually in many workplaces required to leave. That was the retirement age. You did not stay beyond 65. But lots of people are staying beyond 65. Why should they leave when they're still productive and when they're earning now at the top of their game? Think of an academic like myself as an example. I'm earning the best money I have as an academic in 20 years or more of being an academic and a full-time academic. And they want me if they wanted me to retire because I turned 65, I'd say, go F yourself. Sorry to be vulgar, but it's not, it is against the law in Canada to require somebody to retire arbitrarily at an arbitrary age. There are some exceptions to that, but even the exceptions should be revisited. But certainly in academia, as an example, why should somebody retire at 65? You think they suddenly turn stupid at 65? No, of course not, right? Are they still producing and so on? So related to this idea of older workers in the workplace is the idea of ageism. You've heard of racism, you've heard of sexism. Have you heard of ageism? Now, some of your other professors like Dr. Dye, Dr. Price may deal with ageism. But it's basically the idea that we hold perceptions of older workers that they can't keep up, that they don't have contemporary skills. They're just not as useful in the workplace as they used to be. And that's a load of crap. And now let me give you a non-academic example. If you look, I don't know where you would find it, but if you stream a movie, I think it was called Sully, Sully. It's about a pilot named Sullivan. His nickname was Sully. This is a real story, by the way. He was just at the retirement age for pilots. I don't think he had passed but he was within months, I think, of the normal retirement age. And he was taking off from an airport in New York, and I don't remember which one it was, JFK maybe. And just as they're taking off, they hit a flock of Canada geese. And both engines on the way up at only about 3,000 or 4,000 feet, I think it was, were knocked out, completely knocked out. They lost all power. And so what are you going to do when you're barely moving, you're barely getting enough air under your wings to keep you up, and both engines are knocked out? Sully made an incredible decision to glide the airplane into the Hudson River, into the flat, calm water of the Hudson River, because he couldn't. At the time, he didn't exactly know what he could do. He couldn't. There was an airport ahead of him, small one. He couldn't make that, and in order to get any other airport, he would have had to make a 180-degree turn. And he thought, there's no way I can get back there, or I don't have enough confidence that I have the airspeed and altitude to get back to that airport. So he made an incredibly gutsy decision to glide the plane into the river. And the plane came to rest almost perfectly, sitting on top of the water. And everybody got out, and everybody was rescued by boats out on the river at the time. And in a very orderly fashion, everybody lived, and he was hailed as a hero. But then he was also, they attempted to reprimand him by showing that he could have gone back to the airport. And what the findings of the study eventually showed was that the only way the airplane could have been taken back to the airport and avoided landing, somewhere like the river, was if the pilot knew that, everything, all the little details, and practiced the details in advance. And it was only one in, I don't know, 10 or 20 trials that ended up with the airplane safely back at the airport. So he made a really gutsy decision. Everybody lived, and it was incredible. Now, and he was also, by the way, a pilot trainer. Now, think about it. Now, this guy is right at retirement age. Would you rather have him at the yoke of the airplane flying your plane, or some snotty-nosed 25-year-old or something who just got his wings? Is that, who would you prefer to have flying you? So arbitrary retirement age is it depends on what the business is, what the job is, and what competencies are needed, and whether the individual still fulfills the competencies. Stop making assumptions. So age is one of those things we should not make assumptions about. Sex would be another thing. Gender, sex, race, and so on. Yeah, let's move on. So just to complete that discussion of an aging workplace, an aging workforce, it's due to several factors. One is that um, um, beginning at the end of the Second World War, servicemen and women came back from the war, and they, put their libido, well, I shouldn't say they put their libidos aside, but they put their baby making abilities aside for the period of the war. And they came back in 1946, 1947, even in 1945, and they started making babies in huge numbers. And we referred to that time, this was the beginning of the time called the baby boom. So an enormous number of babies were born, and that continued until, well, roughly the mid 60s. And I was born at the tail end of that boom. And so what did that boom mean in general Canadian society? Well, it meant we had to build new schools, lots of new schools. In fact, where I grew up in the Waverley, Fall River, Sackville area, the schools for a while, there were high schools going up, every few years. In fact, the year I started high school, we had, I think, around 1,500 students in my high school. And before I graduated, that had grown to, I think, close to 2,000. And we had to do split shifts in my grade 12 year. And then another new school, it opened, almost, well, not very far away, and just within a year or two of that. And then we had to have expansion of all kinds of other, public facilities and so on. And so the number of people then growing up, and entering the workforce in the mid 60s and late 60s would also boom. University enrollments boomed, community college enrollments boomed, and consumer goods boomed. Many people were buying homes to raise those children, or apartments, and they needed stoves and refrigerators and cars, and because of course there was urban sprawl, the suburban areas of cities were spreading like wildfire, and so streets were being paved, and new malls and stuff like that were being thrown up, and so there was a lot of consumption going on, which fueled the economy, dramatically fueled the economy, and that created even more jobs. And but then things started slowing down later in the 80s and 90s, in the 80s in particular, I would say. But also there were some things happening in the late 70s as well, like a fuel crisis, a gasoline crisis, an oil crisis, I should say, and that forced us to start thinking about not just growing, and I shouldn't say forced us, but as a society, we did kind of take it in under our wing to become more efficient, to become more fuel efficient, to check the growth of wages. And real wages, in an average sense, real wages have not grown substantially since the 1970s. And part of that is because in the 1970s, the union, this is true in the US more so than in Canada, but in the 1970s, union density, actually in the 1950s, union density had already peaked. And by the 1970s, the absolute number of workers who were unionized also started to decline. And so union representation of workers started to plummet. Now in the U.S., I think in the private sector, it's only about 5% of workers are represented by a union in the private sector. It's higher. It's in the teens, I think, in the public sector. But workers who are unionized tend to earn more money. And the minimum wage in many parts of the U.S., including the federal minimum wage, is, I believe, still $7.50. Holy crap. And so in the West, in North America, at least the US and Canada, wages have stagnated terribly. So workers are not really getting ahead to the same extent they were. And so we've had this sort of inward kind of inflection. And many of those older workers who would have retired at 65 haven't been able to earn enough money to be able to afford. So many of those workers, so I think there's at least two good reasons why people are resisting retirement. One is they can't afford to. And think about women who have always been paid less than men. On average, they have always been paid less than men, and how much of an influence that, pay for the past 30 or 40 years would have on their decision to retire and the conditions in which they would retire compared to the men. That's one reason, economic necessity, keep working. And the other is, well, if you're doing something you enjoy and you're still productive, why would you want to retire if you're still productive? I have friends in academia who are teaching well into their 70s. They may have left their original employer, but they're still, attached to universities. They're still as adjunct university or adjunct professors or whatever, and they're still doing very useful research and contributing to academia. And so why retire? Think about that airline pilot. Why would he have to retire? There's no real good reason. One of the trends that seems to displease some Canadians, white Canadians that is, and some of them in my family actually, is the trend to increase immigration to Canada. So our non-white minorities are growing in terms of their absolute numbers and their proportion of the population and their representation in the workplace. Now, you could complain about that, but I think you'd be silly to. I think you'd be shooting yourself in the foot. Because if what's important to Canada is a growing and vital, resilient economy with new ideas and new ways of doing things, to remain competitive in a competitive economic, milieu, then we need that new blood. We need those ways of seeing the rest of the world, understanding it, and bringing that, in many cases, youthful energy to the economy. And so immigration has actually created in my mind anyway, not just my mind, but I think many would reach the conclusion that it's been very good for Canada, for its development, its economic development, for its cultural development. But if you've been among the privileged white population, the European population of Canada for a long, long time, and if you're not white, you haven't been among the privileged. Think of the black population of Nova Scotia as an example. People who think that Canada needs to be saved. Well, ask a black Nova Scotian if Canada needs to be saved. Have they experienced the same kind of Canada that you have, or some other visible minority, a woman, in fact. Many women don't experience Canada the way white men do. And so don't make assumptions about what is appropriate or what is right or what is good for Canada. Check. I would argue that you should look at the actual outcome. Is Canada a better place to live? Are we more resilient? Are we organized in such a way that we're looking forward to the future instead of looking backward at the past? I like that. You can use that if you want. Are we looking backward? In fact, the argument has been made that Canada is the first postmodern society. That argument's been made for at least a decade now, maybe longer. And the idea is that there are so many different viewpoints in Canada that no one dominant viewpoint has been allowed to continue to dominate in the same way that it did 40, 50, 60 years ago. You go back, sometimes you'll hear me say the good old days. Well, the good old days weren't necessarily very good. Consider, for instance, that, in the 60s or 60, 70, 80 years ago, if you were a gay man, you could lose your job simply for being a gay man. If you were black, you might not be served in a restaurant or a bar or a diner, or you'd have to sit separately. If you were, and so on. You get what I mean. The things have changed quite dramatically in those 80 years or so, but there's still a long way to go. Racism, sexism, and discrimination against immigrants. Just think about what's going on in the U.S. right now. The bipolar arguments in the middle of an election campaign for president. This polarized discussion or argument about the validity of an immigration policy and how to make it better and how to make the immigration policy better. It's a divisive issue in the U.S. and it doesn't need to be. We just look at the how positive the outcomes can be, how productive the outcomes can be, and I think that will change your beliefs. So we're still talking about um, uh, race and sex and immigration and so on in Canada because the topic is discrimination. And these numbers, again, are from almost a decade ago. But I would also argue, though, that even though they're older numbers, they may still be relevant, but I think they're probably understating the problem as well. That more Canadians than admit here probably experience racial discrimination. But we're Canadian. We're more reluctant to report stuff like that. Um, but here's 26% of Canadians surveyed said that they've experienced age-based discrimination at work. And there's all kinds of discrimination. I run into people in my family, even again, who say, oh, discrimination is a thing of the past. Well, I've got news for you. It definitely is not. And that I've made my research program around discrimination essentially over the past several years, looking at sex and race. And I'm about to look at race discrimination in Africa and sex discrimination here in Canada, and then Indigenous discrimination in South America. These are my projects for the next several years. Why would I choose something like that? Because it's so common. Because discrimination is so common, and because it reveals so much about how management is problematic. I've used that term before, just like a day or so ago, problem. Your studies will almost never, and the research that's done to support your studies, almost never problematizes management. And yet it's management that is many times the problem, the most important problem. Because they're as capable of mistakes in the workplace, they're as capable of bias and discrimination in the workplace as any other worker, maybe more capable. But the lens never points toward them. Isn't that interesting? Now, isn't this interesting? See, I was talking about the baby boom earlier, but we are seeing a changing of the guard. And as important as the baby boom generation was, they are also, by the way, they began retiring in large numbers before COVID hit. But when COVID hit, the numbers really started to shoot up. And why would that be? Well, if you're, anywhere near retirement age and you have to face the challenges of a COVID workplace and all that that represents, and it represented a hell of a challenge. I think I've already talked to you about, how it affected the healthcare system as a workplace, how many nurses and doctors left the system because of the challenges of COVID. Not just like ordinary challenges, but like life-threatening challenges in some case, or thinking if you're thinking about the safety of your family and you're going to a place of work where you could pick up a virus that could kill somebody in your family, you may think twice about keeping that job. So a lot of people at or near or maybe a little bit beyond the normal sort of retirement age took up retirement because of COVID. And I don't know if that trend has continued, but certainly the baby boom is at that age. And, as I mentioned, I'm closer to the tail end of the baby boom, but they're still a few years behind me. People, who are a little bit younger than me, still coming through the system, and they will, largely, they will retire. And so that creates, and what I have found with our graduates from the BBA program, and especially from the employment relations program, is that they, over the past several years, in spite of COVID, they haven't had as much difficulty finding work as I would have expected. And they're getting really good jobs. And so think about it this way. When people in their 50s and 60s, and maybe even beyond, are retiring, when they retire, they take knowledge with them. And just give you one example, think about all the computer programs that have to run in the federal government so that all the different programs that support Canadians can run. CPP, the Canada Pension Plan, Employment Insurance, EI, the baby bonus checks, all kinds of programs that require checks to be written and deposited in people's accounts, or hard written. Some people still receive these things in hard copy, and there are computer programs that were written in the 1960s, sometimes running these programs. So these are programs that Canadians have come to rely on to support, especially support people in their older age, for instance, or people with young families, or people who lose their jobs suddenly. These are people who depend on these so-called social safety nets. And who's going to maintain these systems? Some of the computer programming from the 1960s is, we don't use it today, except that we still have these computers running with this programming language. The one I'm thinking of primarily is called COBOL. And nobody today in their right mind would write a program using COBOL. But they still exist. I was a programmer in Fortran. Fortran is still all over the place. And yet all these people who ran these systems for decades, suddenly they're retiring in huge numbers. So if you have any kind of background in project management, or actually, I would argue also in human resource management or employment relations, so that you understand the importance of work in a person's life, and you understand something about the systems of employment, you could be a very valuable person in right now and still in the next few years, because somebody has to do this work. work. Somebody has to figure out how to keep these systems running so that the Canadian government, so the Canadian nation can keep running. A lot of opportunity. So good luck with that. Another thing that I guess I already talked about this, but yeah, the wage gap between men and women, it does still exist. And even though we've made progress toward bridging that gap, narrowing the gap through law, for one thing, and greater awareness, and educating women to fight for what they're worth, we still find a gap, and so that gap seems to come down primarily to what we might refer to as labor wage rates or labor market wage rates. And so many in business, because they're market determinists. Remember that I asked you about, are you do you which do you think is more important, agency or determinism? Many in business will argue, well, let the market determine. Problem is that the market discriminates against women. So will we let that continue? And the answer has been pretty much resoundingly in the Western countries, the industrialized countries, no. Even though there's been quite a bit of pushback from places like the U.S. in particular, but also here in Canada, we've still managed to improve the lot of women. And why? Just one reason why that's important, not only for fairness and equity and recognition of women's worth and effort, but because, as I said, if a woman works for 40 years, let's say, and consistently earns 10 to 20% less than a man, that carries over into their retirement. The level of poverty of women is driven at least partly because they've earned less throughout a lifetime of work than men have. So think about that. That could be your grandmother or even your mother for that matter. Is that really what you think should be allowed to happen? And so one of the ways, and I would say absolutely not. So we still have this wage gap. How do we close it? Well, a tactic that some industrialized countries, especially I've heard about it in the Nordic countries, Northern European countries in particular, where corporations and other employers are required to break down and publish wage rates according to sex and age and stuff like that, and a position, what job, what role the individual does in the organization. And when you publish that information, it becomes pretty obvious that some groups are being paid less than other groups, even though they're doing essentially the same jobs with essentially the same credentials and so on. And so by publishing that information, in other words, and we've done this recently in Canada, as a matter of fact, that's where I'm going with this, at the federal level at least. In publishing that information, a couple of things happen. One is that we become aware of where the discrepancies are because they're published right there in black and white. And then that is, to the employer, that should be an embarrassment. If they're not embarrassed by those differences, they should be. And many progressive employers will be, because they know, for instance, look at what I've talked about earlier. Women are in the ascendant in the workplace in many respects. If you want to attract women to your workplace, don't pay them less than men. Don't pay them less than they're worth. And so if you publish information that objectively identifies women as lower paid than men, it should embarrass you. It should embarrass employers. So that's one reason for doing it. And then the other reason that's embedded in the legislation, or at least it should be embedded in the legislation, is that the employer should show how they're going to correct that discrepancy. So the employer should also be prepared to defend plans to increase women's wages, not to exceed men, but to meet men, based on qualifications, experience, and a couple of other issues, but not to be taking advantage of women based on market inefficiencies. Essentially, the markets discriminate. The markets. This is one of those places where I think I might have mentioned to you, don't let market determinism determine what is the right thing for you to do. the right thing for you to do is to pay women fairly. And so that's what we're doing by requiring these employers to publish that information. So in Canada, the federal government just about maybe 3 or 4 years ago implemented that kind of legislation. We already had pay equity legislation at the federal level, but added to that legislation was the requirement that federally regulated employers, think the military, RCMP, the banks, the airline industry, and on and on and on, they're required to publish their wage rates, the actual wages and salaries paid to employees broken down by sex and position and so on. And so that should begin to close the discrepancy, at least within the federal sector. Unfortunately, that's only about 10% of the workforce. So, but in the past, that kind of demonstration has had an influence on other large jurisdictions as well, like Ontario and Quebec, and where most of workers are, or most workplaces are regulated. It's interesting to see that Canada, we're such a good country, blah, blah, blah. And yet we have been rated all the way down at eighth in terms of our gender wage gap in industrialized countries. Wow. And another thing that I've been told, and I don't know that this is true, but this is anecdotal. But I've also, and actually there's a source for it here, but again, it's a little bit old, but that women with university degrees still can earn less than men. And what I've heard is that it's women may earn more on their way out of their university or community college programs than men do, but men very quickly zoom past women. And for whatever reason, I think as employers we deserve, or women deserve, our attention to this issue. Are we paying them fairly? Are we discriminating against them as they get more experience in the workplace, where they should be worth more? Here are several other trends that are troubling. Um, Even though the number of women in the workplace is increasing, and we're very close to the number of women equaling the number of men in the workplace today. However, at the top of the organizational hierarchy, up in management, in other words, we find that women are still very disadvantaged compared to men. It's very common to find that among the management ranks and on the board of directors of various corporations in Canada and other kinds of organizations as well, that the numbers of men and women are very unbalanced, like something like 80 to 20, 80% men, 20% women. Women seem to have hit a ceiling of about 22% roughly in terms of the board of directors and top management, for instance. And yet these organizations purport to either represent or sell services to or products to all Canadians, and about half of Canadians are women. How can they say that they represent those interests when they're so poorly represented in the management of the organization? A couple of examples that I can point to. One is our own university. When I arrived here 15 years ago, our board of governors was only about 1/4 women. Of 30 odd positions, only about 8 of the positions were filled with women. And not that these two things are directly related, but I'm sure they are kind of related. There were some amazingly inappropriate things happening on campus, often involving students. Things that should not have been allowed, certainly should not have been encouraged, and should be made to go away, but they were still happening. This is only about 15, 14 years ago, or even less, and they may even still happen, for all I know. But I don't hear about them as much anymore, so I'm not unhappy about that. But in the meantime, we're back to, I shouldn't say we're back to, but the proportion of women on the Board of Governors has increased to about an even level with men on the Board of Governors. So that's a good start. And it does seem to have resulted in some real changes to the organization, to the university's culture. So what have I noticed in those 15 years or so? There are organizations on campus like a committee to I don't know what they call themselves exactly, but to study and recommend policy and investigation of sexual assault, for instance, on campus. I should have looked up what they're called here, but you guys are going to do this in a couple of weeks, so maybe I'll save that for you guys to tell me. And there are other offices around equity and diversity and so on that are now open today that were not here 15 years ago. We even have an assistant dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion. His name is Juan Carlos, I believe. I believe that's his position title. And we have an equity officer. And those things. If we had those things, actually, a real joke around campus at one time was that the equity office was only open for like a day or a half a day a week. And so there were all these things of a sexualized or gendered nature happening on campus, and there was no effort to combat it, to countervail it. So that has changed. Let me give you another anecdote about, well, when Justin Trudeau became prime minister in, I'm going to say the year was 2015. I'm pretty sure it was, but so 9 years ago roughly, from today's date anyway. The first thing he did, and he got a lot of flack for this, but I didn't vote for him, but when he did this, I said, all right, I will support this guy. And whatever he wants to do, I will support him. And he named at that time the caucus, the cabinet. So these would be kind of like the management group of the government of Canada. And at that time, there were somewhere around 45 or 50 cabinet members or assistants, or related to cabinet anyway. And what he did in 2015 was half of those positions were named to women. And right off the bat, I remember a news conference. I remember almost a visual, certainly the words he used. He was asked by a reporter, can you explain your decision to make half of these positions or name half of these positions to women? And he said, because it's 2015. And I said, all right, man, you are doing the right thing. I actually have encountered resistance in my classroom to this idea as well. And if you look, this is one of those discussions or one of these items that I've listened to with Jordan Peterson, for example. He complains about this, in the implication of Jordan Peterson's argument, which isn't well founded, by the way, but the implication is that Trudeau was overlooking better talent, more competent people that he could have named to cabinet. And one of my responses would be, well, tell me which of those women that he named to cabinet were not qualified to do the job. Tell me which one. Stop being lazy and making assumptions about women and tell me who was not qualified to do the job. And of course, as soon as you ask that, the stupid people shut their mouths because they don't have an answer. They don't know who is not competent. They have no idea. And then again, show me in the intervening years, since then, 9 years, show me which of those cabinet members have proven to not be competent. And I can't remember a single person who embarrassed the prime minister or embarrassed Canada, not a single one. And yet, when you appoint men, they pretty much, not all of them, but many of them regularly embarrass the country and embarrass the prime minister. And they have to be ushered out. So don't tell me that women don't deserve those jobs. First of all, it's not the 100-meter dash. It's not the fastest. It's government, for God's sake. And 50, as I've said already a couple times in this presentation, 50% of the country is women. 50% is male. 50% of the issues are arguably women's issues. put women in charge. And I was very proud, extremely proud. And I know there are a lot of men who blah 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 blah, and probably some women too, even, but a lot who. One of my cousins, actually, a woman, she is, oh my God, she hates Trudeau, and but not again. I haven't voted for the guy, but I support him because he's doing many of the right things. So there was a point, and I think it's no, it's not true today, but there was a point where the top three jobs in cabinet, well, top three that I would consider very, very important, were all given to women. Actually, no, it was top four jobs were all given to women. Three women held four jobs that are almost always held by men. One was the deputy prime minister, who also held the job of minister of I believe it was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I'm sorry I don't remember her name, but she still holds those positions. The Minister of Defense was a woman, Anita Anand, and I can talk more about that. Maybe when I get to the section on gender, I'll talk more about that. And then the third one was, and I'm going to forget her name now at the moment, but she's still in the same position. 9 years later, she's still doing. I think I gave her job away to the deputy prime minister. Okay, I'm mixing them up now. She may have been the name to the Melanie Jolie. She's from Quebec, and she's been in that. I think it's Foreign Affairs. So what was the other job that the deputy prime minister was doing? Oh, she was the finance minister. So the four probably biggest jobs in the country done by women. Now the only one who is not in that position still is Anita Anand, and one of the reasons why Anita was named to the position in the Department of Defense was because the Department of Defense and the RCMP, by the way, have had such problems with sexism in their ranks. Sexism, misogyny, violence against women, and they're so unable to recruit a more diverse workforce, and they need to because the ranks are depleted. The military is down at least 15,000 members, and women could be holding some of those positions, but who would join the military based on the sexism and violence against women? So anyway, you got to fix those things. So Anita Anand, who was named to head up the Department of Defense, she was there not because of her knowledge of military issues, but because of her knowledge of the law of human rights and trying to make a difference to the sexist culture of the military. And again, we have the same sort of issues, or many of the same issues, in the RCMP. And so there was a reason for why he appointed Anita Anand. And she did what she could, and she made some changes, and hopefully those changes will bear fruit over time. Sorry, I had to take a glass of water there. Two more issues that are on this slide. People are generally working harder today than they used to. So work intensity is increasing. People have to do more with less, less pay, less time, and so on, and they're required to stay later and do extra overtime and blah blah blah. That really hasn't changed much, and yet many people are forced to work part-time work and receive part-time wages. And part-time wages are almost always less than full-time wages. Now, why? So why are so many jobs part-time? And a very simple reason, and probably the most powerful reason, is that employers are looking to reduce their costs. You've already heard me talk about this in the classroom. Where is the balance between wealth generation and doing the right thing for Canadians and the environment? One or the other wins, but what you really need to find is a balance. And yet there's always pressure on workers and their wages and their hours. And when you're a part-time worker, you're almost always far more vulnerable, and because you're in danger of losing your job almost every day. Part-time workers don't get the same kind of protection as full-time workers do. They get lower pay and they get fewer benefits. Part-time work is a way to make workers more precarious, more vulnerable, and lower their costs, and then make them very expendable. Easy to hire, easy to get rid of. And so that's another dirty little secret of business, of organizations. And so the part-time work is prevalent and rising, and not just part-time work, but any kind of think of the gig economy as an example. How many workers now, call driving an Uber their primary form of employment? This is a tendency that probably will only be replaced by robots. And so where will those workers work after they've been made redundant? Not only vulnerable, but now redundant. These are some of the issues that you're going to have to deal with. So this particular slide was written before COVID, but isn't it interesting that it's still very relevant? Because during COVID, of course, most of us worked from home. I don't know how long it was. It was at least 2 semesters, maybe 3 semesters that I did, or maybe more, that I did my teaching from, online over MS Teams. Same way you do your stuff. I assume you guys do your stuff today too. And so many people moved home, and now many employers, including the government of Canada and others, are requiring workers to go back to the office. And so the question is, well, why? What was wrong with working at home? Why is it necessary for people to be in the office? And I'll just to sort of describe one phenomenon that I think helps to explain that. And that is that managers are not very confident about how they manage. And so managers don't like not having the worker in front of them where they can see them and try to measure their output and their performance and their effort because they can see them. So and in some cases now there's more to that story than that, but I think that's at least part of the reason that managers want workers back in the workplace. What's difficult for managers typically is that if they can't see the worker, they don't know how to set performance expectations, and then they don't know how to hold the individual accountable. They don't know how to connect all the dots, and it's the same. They should be doing virtually the same thing when everybody's in the workplace. But they're not doing a very good job when they're all in the workplace. But they feel better because at least they can see the person. But they should be doing the same thing in the workplace, communicating expectations, providing support, making sure that the appropriate support is in place, and then communicating with your employee if they're not meeting expectations, discovering what additional support they might need, training and other things, and then if necessary, disciplining them. And then, if necessary, letting them go. But most managers have no idea. So many managers have no idea how to connect these dots. It isn't rocket science, but they don't know how to do it, or they don't have the mental discipline to do it. Around the time of COVID really getting underway, I talked to an HR manager actually in a backyard party right next door to where I live here, and I talked to an HR manager from one of the companies doing computer graphics here in Halifax, and they moved everybody home during COVID, and she reported, in fact, that their productivity had gone up. And then she described how she kept track of performance well, people are out of the workplace. How do you manage it? And she said, oh, we do blah, 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 blah. And we do weekly meetings. And I set out performance standards each and every week. And then I compare their actual performance to the standards we've set and talk about discrepancies and, difficulties they may have, and then set new standards for the next week. And she was just basically doing her job. And it worked because the workers didn't have to be right there in front of them. They had to be managed, but they didn't necessarily have to be visible, physically visible. And so I would argue that a good portion of what's going on with this demand that workers come back to the workforce is managerial incompetence. Again, the problem was with management, not with workers. The assumption is that workers are lazy and not doing their jobs. Well, maybe the assumption to be that managers don't know how to manage. and you need better managers. Maybe you need to select them more carefully. You need to train them to be able. And I actually could put a pretty good program together on performance management because that was essentially the gist of my honors dissertation, my doctoral dissertation. Okay, there was something else about homework I was going to say, but I've forgotten what. So I started off earlier in this lecture talking about globalization and why it was such a good topic for business students to discuss because I would argue that globalization among business academics and practitioners tends to be very one-sided. Globalization is either something to do with competition, at least. Either a great opportunity to take advantage of new markets, or the competitors are coming. So you will hear me talk occasionally about competition from China, for example, in the auto industry. The future auto industry looks very Chinese. The up and coming automakers are largely China based and Chinese companies. They're making brilliant cars at very low prices. And we've seen this before, of course. There was a period of time in the 1970s, I'll say, when Japanese cars made an invasion of North America their thing. And then a couple decades, maybe 3 or 4 decades, probably 3 decades later, the 80s, 2 decades, I guess that is. No, I guess it would only be a decade and a half or so, maybe 2 decades at the most later. Korean automakers made a big splash. And today, one of the best cars you can buy in North America is a Korean car, Hyundai or Kia. And the Japanese, actually, interestingly, the Japanese, even though Toyota is still the dominant car maker by unit volume at least, even though Toyota is still a dominant car maker in the world, their dominance is fraying. It's beginning to erode, and it's difficult to say just what will be left of the Japanese auto manufacturing sector by the time electric vehicles become the dominant form of ground transportation throughout the world. I should mention too, and I probably told you about this already, but there are four, I guess, arguably, but three big cohesive auto markets in the world: Europe, North America, in particular Canada and the U.S., and China. These are the three big markets, and then there's the rest of the world, which all taken together, the entire rest of the world, is about the same size as roughly as those three markets. So China is the biggest by unit volume, with somewhere over 25 million cars a year being made. North America, we're sitting at probably somewhere around 15, 16, 17 million. And Europe would be roughly the same. The total value of units sold in North America by North American companies, at least, is on par with China or greater than China because the unit prices are higher. Unit prices in China tend to be much lower. So you hopefully, if you're paying attention, again, I know business students don't seem to do this sort of thing, but don't tend to do this thing anyway, paying attention to what's going on in the news. But you should have heard recently that Canada and the U.S. are slapping a 100% duty on top of what duties already exist, a 100% duty against Chinese cars, Chinese-made cars. In particular, I should say Chinese-made cars made by Chinese companies, because I'm not sure that Tesla is going to suffer the same kind of duty. It's an American company being made, cars being made in China by an American company. But all the other car companies in China pretty much will be faced with basically double. So imagine that China was able to sell a car in Canada for, let's say, a really nice low price of $25,000 for a quality vehicle in Canada. Because of that duty, the car would sell for now at least $50,000. So it changes the viability of Canada as a marketplace, and it's basically the U.S. is basically doing the same thing. Huge duties on cars, and why are they doing that? Well, to protect domestic automakers. So domestic automakers are not very competitive. They don't make very good product. They make huge gas guzzling projects or a product, and they're not very good at making electric vehicles yet, except for Tesla. They do a very poor job of making electric vehicles. And yet, by the end of this decade, at least 50% of all vehicles will be electric. At least, and probably quite a bit more than that. So who's going to make the cars for North America? American automakers? So now they're being protected from these low price but high quality automakers. Where are those cars going to come from? Now, it may happen that many of these cars made, owned or built by Chinese automakers will actually get made or assembled in Mexico, which has a free trade deal with Canada and the United States. So they'll do a sort of end run around these duties. Another country that could supply us with these cars is Korea. As I mentioned, Hyundai and Kia do a very good job, and South Korea is one of our allies, so they don't face the same kind of restrictions. Likewise, the Japanese automakers. Problem with the Japanese automakers is that they're so slow, and really they have not embraced electric vehicles yet, even though Toyota's been making hybrid electric vehicles for at least 20 years, if not 30 years. Probably a quarter of a century. But they think the world is going to be driven by hydrogen, and they keep pushing hydrogen or hybrid cars. In other words, cars that still burn gasoline. And they're going to wake up one day, and their dominance is going to disappear. It already is, actually, to some extent. They're already experiencing the end. Why was I talking about that? Globalization. Well, there were some interesting things going on in terms of globalization. I should also mention, too, another sort of thing that happened during COVID, an interesting sort of phenomenon, was that many car companies discovered during COVID that having a dependence on low-cost parts makers in China, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and elsewhere was a dangerous thing to do, because for months and months and months at a time, supplies weren't arriving to make those cars. Like one particular supply, largely dominated by Taiwan, that breakaway province of China. Many of the semiconductors, they dominate in the manufacture of semiconductors. So many of the car companies, Ford and GM in particular, and others as well, they could not get semiconductors. And typical cars today have dozens, if not hundreds, of semiconductors, driving everything from the power windows to the windshield wipers, and all kinds of other stuff. So a car company like Tesla, which had vertically integrated their supply system, so they were not dependent as much on suppliers, and they had just the world's best engineering core. They could either made their own supplies, or they did workarounds, like in the semiconductor area. They would take semiconductors from anywhere, and because of their engineering prowess, they could reprogram the semiconductors, the chips. So they didn't have to have certain chips programmed by some other company. They could do it. They could program themselves, and so they were agnostic as far as where the chips came from. So that helped them out a whole lot. And so many companies are now touting the benefits of vertical integration, doing more of these things themselves. But anyway, globalization in terms of what's talked about in business circles today, we tend to think of brands like McDonald's or any of the gas companies, Exxon and Esso and so on and so forth, and Shell and consumer brands like Coke and Pepsi and then methods like just-in-time management or total quality management or lean production. These things have become global sort of ideas. But they are, it's a shorthand, and it is really not an accurate representation of what globalization means in the big sense. So one of the questions I am bound to ask you on a test or somewhere anyway is discuss why globalization is a strongly contested concept. Remember, again, I've talked about what a contested idea is. I've talked about how much of what you're learning is contested. In other words, what you're learning is problematic. Well, why is the use of globalization problematic? One reason is that we can't even agree on what globalization means. So it means different things to different people. So when we talk about globalization, what are we talking about? One of the things that is contested, and it is problematic, is that the effects of globalization are not desirable. Uh, Somewhere in my notes here, maybe, oh yeah, down below here, we may be concerned that national and regional cultures may be submerged within a common global capitalist culture. You know, when you look at countries like in the Middle East as an example, or South America as another great example, or Africa as another great example, many of these people do not want to be Americanized. They hate the American model of capitalism. And with good reason, because they are almost always the people being exploited. Their resources or their people are being exploited by these large American multinationals through, mining. Actually, Canada has a terrible record in mining. Something like 75% of all the mining companies. Now, this is mining other than gas and oil and coal. 75% of all mining companies in the world, and I think this was true in 2020. I think it's still true, roughly true anyway. 75% of those companies are headquartered in Canada, and these companies go out around the world to places where the local people are vulnerable. They don't, even though their communities depend on and have long lived in these territories, they get pushed off. Now, it may not be the Canadian company that's doing the pushing, but the Canadian company does it knowingly or enters into these agreements with local interests, and the local interests knowingly push, or the Canadian companies knowingly do business with these local interests, knowing that these people are, sometimes they kill local activists, people who resist. When I was in Oaxaca, down in Mexico, a few years ago, when I went into the central market, every day I went into the central market, and there were pictures of dozens of people who had either been murdered or disappeared because they were putting up resistance to. At that time, there was a particular mining operation, and the miner itself was a Canadian company. In fact, I just got back from one visit to Oaxaca, came home, and there's a newspaper article, when there still were newspapers, there was a newspaper article about an activist who was, he was driving out on a country road outside of the city, and his car was riddled with bullets by a group of thugs. Let's call them fascist thugs, because they were people hired by the interests, the moneyed interests who wanted the mine developed. They hired these guys with guns. And by the way, the guys with guns could very well have been police officers off duty, just anxious to make extra money and didn't care who they shot at. Police, you don't want to tangle with police in Mexico. The army is very professional. The police forces are, whoa, don't tangle with them. They can be deadly. We have Coke. Actually, there was just in the news a couple of days ago. There was a story about some place. I think it was in the Middle East, and for some reason, it was either Coke or Pepsi wasn't going to be made. And the local people who made soft drinks were like, or whatever kind of leisure drink, was made there, were like, all right, now a chance for our local culturally appropriate drink to make a comeback. Interesting, eh? We see that same sort of colonization or imperialism in things like software as well. I mean, think about how Microsoft and Google and all these massive software programs, how they work and what values are embedded. Are they Western values? Are they Middle Eastern values? Are they Latin American values? Or are they American values? Think about it. What gets embedded in these pieces of software? So this concept generates a lot of debate and a lot of conflict. There's debate on the extent to which globalization is actually occurring. As I just mentioned, for instance, many companies are pulling in their far-fledged, supply system to become more vertically integrated, bringing in their supply system closer to home so that they're not held ransom to things like COVID, or imagine all the other challenges we're going to face in the future, and then what that could do to a supply chain. Um, and globalization hasn't been, there have been winners and losers in globalization, and the winners have tended to be Western, and the losers have tended to be everybody else. Everybody else loses their culture, they lose their economies, they lose their control of their countries, and so on and so forth, and many other things. And so as far as globalization goes, it's a very short section in your textbook, but it's really important for you to understand why it's contested and what are the issues involved. See if some of these articles still exist. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to check if they're still there, but see what if they're still there, and what ideas they are trying to impart, and what other debates are ongoing. And in fact, one of your assignments will be to debate each other on particular topics, and maybe you'll discover some topic that you could suggest as a debate for our assignment, for our team assignment. So that debate will take place around the middle of the second half of the course. So we're getting to the end of what I've got prepared so far for today. Anyway, I'm going to have to call a close to this pretty soon, to have it ready for you for tomorrow. There are other topics that I have not or will not get to, but we can discuss them if you need to. Um, so you've already heard me talk about racism. Elitism is maybe a new one to you. Sexism, ageism. I don't know if I've talked about ageism in the classroom, but an attitude toward older workers or toward younger workers as well, that may not be appropriate. That is a barrier to their participation in the workplace. And uh, it's you. There's actually a movie, an Anne Hathaway movie, where she hires an intern who is what's his name? Is in real life I can't think of his name, but he's an older actor, around 80 years old or something like that. He plays a 75-year-old intern in her office, and and the assumption is, oh, he's old, he doesn't know how to do social media, he doesn't have, and stuff like that. But in fact, he has lots of social skills and planning skills and ability to support his fellow workers and things like that. He brings a whole new sensibility to the workplace that Anne Hathaway, as boss in her own business, hasn't paid attention to, or hasn't nurtured in herself or in her followers. And so he brings all of these new competencies to the workplace that make a difference to a lot of people. Anyway, so we've introduced you to some of those problems. Another thing that we haven't talked about yet is how much of what you will witness in a workplace, and even possibly in your textbooks and elsewhere, is the notion that the world should be heterosexist. So, gay partners, lesbian partners don't get represented often. Alternative, family units don't get represented. I mean, think about what's going on, the debate that's going on in the U.S. presidential election right now, and the Republicans and J.D. Vance, the nominee to be vice president for Trump. Oh my God, he is awful. He is completely awful. He's attacked these non-traditional families. He's attacked single mothers. Who else has he attacked recently? He's just after everybody. He actually has said, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he said that women who don't have children are not real Americans. They don't have a vested interest in the future. Well, what about men who don't have children? He doesn't say anything about men, But so he's sexist. He's familyist or something like that, whatever you call that. These are just so outmoded ways of thinking, and the Republicans think they can find an audience for this BS. It's really phenomenal, actually. So, and a lot of the U.S. population, they'll go for this stuff, and a lot of Canadians will go for this stuff. Surely we can leave these things in the past, but we're still hanging on to so many of these outmoded ideas. Hopefully, you guys are more progressive than that, and hopefully, by the end of your business degree, you're going to run into, interchange. And I really encourage you to do this. Don't react badly when somebody has a different view than you. Try to understand what that different view is, and like don't turn the other view away. Don't turn away from that other view until you better understand it, at least. And maybe you can change that other person's mind if you think you have a better idea. I certainly think I have better ideas, and that's why I continue to do what I do. So engage in these discussions, and hopefully by the end of your university degree, you will be a much more tolerant person. You will be much more knowledgeable of why we need to fight for people's rights, especially when they're not the same as us, and more so when they're not the same as us. How important that is, and how important it is for a democracy not to just, rule by the whims of the majority, but to protect the minority views as well. That it's a democracy only in the sense that the first past that the party that wins the greatest number of votes gets to govern. That's where democracy, and then in a proper democracy, the rights of all individuals, families, communities, groups, the rights of all, the minimum basic rights of all are recognized and protected. That's why we have a constitution. That's why we have a Bill of Rights, and that's not called the Bill of Rights. It's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In Canada, that's what it's called, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's why we have human rights law, employment equity law, pay equity law, because we care about people and families, and not just about the bottom line. There are social outcomes that we care about. So think about those things. Another global phenomenon. If you're not, just listen to the. Well, actually, it doesn't come up nearly enough in the U.S. presidential debate, or check into the Russia-Ukraine war sometime, and listen to the stories of corruption that drive the Russian government today, and Vladimir Putin, its president. It corrupt. Oh my God, the corruption. And then if you don't already know it, find out about the corruption at the heart of Donald Trump's legacy. His so-called empire, business empire. He is supported largely by corruption and theft, out and out theft. He steals workers, like lawyers and contractors and workers. He steals their wages. He fails to, make good on contracts he enters into with construction people in particular. Many of his, it's legendary almost how many of the lawyers that he has to employ who end up not getting paid for their time. He reneges on their payment. And yet, silly, stupid people, wanting their hour of glory or whatever, still work for him. It's incredible. His empire is, he's a money launderer. His empire, his property empire, is really only held afloat, kept up by money that's funneled into him from Russian oligarchs and Saudi Saudi princes who buy, properties off him, condos and stuff like that. Because if he didn't receive, and by the way, these people are also laundering their money. So he's part of a huge global money laundering operation, a big one. And I shouldn't say huge because there may be bigger, but a very big money laundering operation. His empire is supported by corruption, and they want to elect him a president again. Are you kidding me? Even while he was in office, he was making money off the U.S. He's still making money off the Republican Party, his own party. He charges them exorbitant rates for all kinds of stuff, meeting space and all kinds of stupid stuff. He is the most corrupt, and some will say, well, that's just creative. If that's business, then I don't want any part of it. I will have no part of it. You should have no part of it. If you have any moral center at all, you should say that's not appropriate. People get hurt. He's already been found lying to on his tax returns. He counted money that he paid to a porn star and others too, but in particular, money he paid to a porn star, hush money, to keep her quiet about their one night affair. Big deal. Because he wanted to run for president. He didn't want her coming out and spoiling his chances. So, and he counted the hush money he paid her, he counted as legal expenses and then included those on his tax returns. He he is the most fraudulent American citizen, possibly the most fraudulent American citizen to ever live. Now I know there's probably worse, but he's not who also wants to run for the U.S. Uh, 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 White House these days. Anyway, terrible corruption, absolutely. And there's other forms of corruption too. I don't want to say that he's the only form of corruption, but man, he is as corrupt as they come. Um, so the question is, like, you've heard lots from me about, some of the things at least that I think are important issues. What do you think are important issues? What would you want to research? What would you want to know more about? So think about those. And I think what I'll do is I'll put up a forum where we can surface some of these ideas. So look for that either on this module, the one that opens tomorrow, or next week's module, one or the other. Think about that. Think about what you'd like to know more about. So I have talked about fair trade in class already, and this is one of those global movements. It's small, but we have had some influence, and we do some of what we do has made a difference in the lives of some of the most vulnerable, particularly coffee growers, tea growers, cocoa growers, and so on. These are commodities, and Western companies like Starbucks and Tim Hortons is probably a relatively minor, maybe not minor, but the Western companies who buy coffee beans from these very depressed areas, economically depressed, from populations who are vulnerable, many times indigenous people. I could tell you a lot more about that, but that would take some time, and maybe I'll share some information on that with you if you remind me. It is a global movement that could make a difference in a lot of lives, and it's more widespread than you think. And your coffee and tea and chocolate on campus are from a fair trade company. In other words, just us. They're located at their head office, and roastery is right down the street in Grand Prairie. They are not only a fair trade certified company, but all they sell is fair trade certified coffee, tea, sugar, and chocolate. And they sell other things, of course, but those are all fair trade certified because they're all commodities, and they're all the sorts of things that we can basically steal from the very vulnerable people in parts of the world that are economically depressed. Quite often, indigenous people in places like southern Mexico, Central America, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, probably a couple of other places that I haven't thought of. So we buy coffee and tea from all kinds of places around the world. And chocolate, actually, we mostly get chocolate from some folks in Germany, I think it is. And so they're the fair trade company, and they do a good job on chocolate. So rather than specializing in chocolate as well, we buy their product and then resell it. And I say we because I've been, up until just a month or two ago, I was an investor in Just Us, and I've also been on the board at one time a few years ago, and I still support the company. I'll still chat them up. So it's a response in the sense that we attempt to pay people something closer to a living wage, and something closer to a rate of income that will allow them to develop their communities, their families, and their businesses. And I can tell you more about that. Actually, in Module 3, I can tell you more about that. And we'll also try to improve their working conditions. And Just Us, the manager, Joey, I can't think of his last name at the moment, he travels to many of these, if not all of them, and I don't think he goes every year to all of them, but he sort of rotates through the different co-ops. And they consult. He asks those people what we can do to help them. He advises them on what Just Us could do to improve the money that they pay to. Yeah, imagine that a coffee company would try to find ways to pay more money to the growers instead of trying to pay less money like a Starbucks or a Walmart or an Amazon. They try to pay more money to make the trade balance more fair, as in fair trade. Then make sure you understand the big difference between free trade and fair trade. They are totally different things. Something for you to investigate and figure out, and I'll try to ask you about it next time in class. That's where I'm going to end today. There are still a few more slides, but I think I've got as much done as I can. Don't forget that you have quizzes open and other posts to make and so on. And otherwise, I'll see you next week. Have a nice weekend.